Hi there, this is Reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 15. For 2 days, John and Sylvia and Chris and I loaf and talk and ride up to an old mining town and back, and then it's time for John and Sylvia to turn back home. We ride into Bozeman from the canyon now, together for the last time. Up ahead, Sylvia's turned around for the third time, evidently to see if we're all right. She's been very quiet the last 2 days. A glance from her yesterday seemed apprehensive, almost frightened. She worries too much about Chris and me. So a lot of stuff has come up on this trip, not the least of which was the meeting of the narrator's new friends, John and Sylvia, with Feeders's old friends, the DeWeeses. And there was some incongruity in there. The DeWeeses knew something that John and Sylvia didn't, for example. And who the narrator versus Feeders didn't quite line up exactly. Everything turned out fine, but there was that incongruence to some extent. And also there's been a frank discussion of Chris's burgeoning, ambiguous mental illness. Nowadays, every layperson, every parent would have, well, I shouldn't say that, but many parents would have a ready-made DSM diagnosis of their kid, and I don't know how useful that is, especially in this age of medication. Not that I oppose medication as a rule, but, I think many of us are going to agree that premature diagnoses and premature medication is not always optimal. So, of course, as is the case throughout this book, they discuss their ongoing journey in opposite directions over what else? Beer. And it's a rather, of course, they're going to go off on their motorcycles after that, as usual. It's a rather practical talk. And he says, "This is suddenly very sad to have to talk like this, like casual acquaintances. So sometimes it's a little easy to forget in this high country of the mind that Pirsig is just a plain good novelist. And that's exactly what it's like to say goodbye to someone after being intimately connected for a period of time. So he's really got it right in this sentence. It's awkward when we have to go back to our polite social personalities, as we feel that intimacy of being connected necessarily drift as we separate, one person going one place, one person going the other. So the narrator and Chris spend the morning on a bench labeled "Senior Citizens Only," and I'm not sure what this means symbolically in the book. It's got to mean something. But if no one's around, why not? It's a practical decision. I guess it's kind of like, this is terrible, but we all do it. It's like, because it's a nice bathroom. It's like using the handicap bathroom when the restroom is completely empty. And I'm not sure how high quality that is, but it is, it suits a sort of quality, a practicality in the moment. And we'll see later in Lila that practicality can be a practical decision, can be a moral decision. And no doubt, they would get up from the bench if they had to. We certainly wouldn't use the big bathroom if someone else needed it. But if no one else is around, can we take advantage of something that otherwise would be unoccupied? So you see why there's a certain moral ambiguity in it, and that kind of thing is addressed a lot in Lala. So they tinker around a little while and they take a nap. A restless feeling hits. I get up. "Let's walk for a while," I say. "Where?" "Toward the school." "All right." We walk under shady trees on very neat sidewalks past neat houses. The avenues provide many small surprises of recognition. Heavy recall. He's walked through these streets many times. Lectures. He prepared his lectures in a peripatetic, I don't even know what that word means, manner, using these streets as his academy. The subject he'd been brought here to teach was rhetoric, writing, the second of the 3 R's. He was to teach some advanced courses in technical writing and some sections of freshman English. So obviously this is where Phaedrus taught. And notice he, the narrator, doesn't really decide, I'm in Bozeman, I'm going to go back to where I used to teach just to see what it's like. He sort of does it automatically after doing a bunch of other stuff. And his old self is emerging, and so is some unconscious behavior. And this makes sense if you see it in terms of parts of self. And as I've mentioned before, my model for personality is very much parts oriented. And so this always makes sense to me. And we're all parts. And often one part of us does something that perplexes the rest of ourselves, or we have a part of us that does something spontaneously that, let's just say, the whole totality may not do. And so this situation with Pirsig and his alter ego Phaedrus separated by the electroshock is a good case study for parts of self, because cohesion of parts is very much oriented around memory. And in this case, it's fractured, and memory is a big factor in how integrated our parts are. It's not that simple, but it's probably the main factor. The crushing teaching load was bad enough, but what for him was far worse was that he understood in his precise analytic way that the subject he was teaching was undoubtedly the most unprecise, unanalytic, amorphous area in the entire Church of Reason. That's why he was thinking so hard. To a methodical, laboratory-trained mind, rhetoric is just completely hopeless. More often, and so in terms of his students with this method, more often their writing got worse. It seemed as though every rule he honestly tried to discover with them and learn with them was so full of exceptions and contradictions and qualifications and confusions that he wished he'd never come across the rule in the first place. What he really thought was that the rule was pasted on the writing after the writing was all done. It was post hoc, after the fact, instead of prior to the fact. So what's wrong with that? I don't think anyone needs to guess that any writer, aside from a framework, perhaps, for particular kinds of writing, isn't really using rules to produce the writing. He's using something else. These essays, written using this post hoc structure, are flat, they're awkward, they're empty, they are missing something. What could that be? A certain syrup, as Gertrude Stein said, but it doesn't pour. But how are you to teach something that isn't premeditated? It was a seemingly impossible requirement. He just took the text and commented on it in an unpremeditated way and hoped that the students would get something from that. It wasn't satisfactory. I'm highlighting the word premeditated because it will become important as Phaedrus's theory coalesces, so I'm pointing it out now. You can see his frustration here, and you also see what's happening is these are circumstances that are setting him up for the right environmental conditions to plant something. So they proceed slowly to the building. Huge and strange gables over old dark brown brick. A beautiful building, really. The only one that really seems to belong here. Old stone stairway up the doors. Stairs cupped by wear from millions of footsteps. It is Montana Hall that they are entering at the University of Montana in Bozeman, and here's a picture of it, sent to me by Lee Glover. Phaedrus's office was behind the two small windows up and to the left of the entrance. You can see where that is. And the mascot is a bobcat whose name is Spirit, and so I told Lee that it should be a wolf. And another thing I want to say is, isn't that typical for a university to have one or two really great buildings that fit in with the, let's just say, the idea of a university, and then you'll have some modern buildings, or you'll have a nice old building and they'll have a wing with a lot of glass. I mean, you see it all the time, especially the way universities are kind of becoming big real estate ventures. So Chris doesn't like Montana Hall. There's something about it that really is disconcerting to him. He says it's scary and he wants them to leave right away. So the narrator says, not now. No, now. He looks at me and sees I'm staying. Okay, again, he's staying. Why? His look is so frightened I'm about to change my mind, but then suddenly his expression breaks and he turns and runs down the stairs and out the door before I can follow him. So he proceeds. An unconscious desire to proceed. He could easily say, oh, well, my son's kind of scared and I'm going to follow him out. But there's something taking him in there. And let's just say it's that unconscious force of his second personality. The big heavy door closes down below, and I'm all alone here now. I listen for some sound. Of whom? Of him? I listen for a long time. In this place, he is the reality, and I am the ghost. On one of the classroom doorknobs, I see his hand rest for a moment, then slowly turn the knob, and then push the door open. Okay, obviously, he doesn't know. The narrator doesn't know what classroom this is, but the hand does. And there he is in his old classroom. Everything is the same, including the lack of chalk. Well, they're little stubs, but it's never, it's never properly outfitted. The supplies are kind of, lacking. And beyond the blackboard out the window, you see the mountains. Mountains again, in which he watched out meditatively when the class was immersed in their writing. This was a place where he was received as himself, not as what he could be or should be, but as himself, a place all receptive, listening. He gave everything to it. This wasn't one room, this was 1,000 rooms, changing each day with the storms and snows and patterns of clouds on the mountains, with each class and even with each student. No 2 hours were ever alike, and it was always a mystery to him what the next one would breed. Again, beautiful prose. Suddenly an older student, and older meaning late 20s, a rather mousy student female enters. She looks astonished. Oh my God, she says, is it you? I don't recognize her at all. Nothing. She calls my name and I nod. Yes, it's me. You've come back. I shake my head just for these few minutes. She continues to look until it becomes embarrassing. Now she becomes aware of this herself and asks, may I sit down for a moment? The timid way she asks indicates she may have been a student of his. So she sits down and she's trembling like she's seen a ghost. Well, she has. We heard you were in the hospital. Yes, I say. There's more embarrassed silence. That she doesn't pursue it means she probably knows why. She hesitates some more, searches for something to say. This is getting hard to bear. Where are you teaching? She finally asks. I'm not teaching anymore. I've stopped. She looks incredulous. You've stopped? She frowns and looks at me again as if to verify that she is really talking to the right person. You can't do that. I keep wondering who she is, and her expression looks equally baffled. But that's just... The sentence drops off. She tries again. But you're just being completely... But this sentence fails too. The next word is crazy, but she caught herself both times. So we start to have an idea of the impact this man had on his students. And there have been comparisons of Phaedrus to Christ. Obviously, many times the hero is compared to Christ. We know that Christ, the story of Christ is the ultimate hero myth, but there are some interesting comparisons here. In particular, for example, this is a man who is driven by the search for connection to something great and executed for the crime of shaking up the system, but leaving behind a legacy of profoundly transformative ideas and, we may argue, in the process of resurrection. The student leaves apparently distraught at the incongruity of Phaedrus in body, but not in spirit. Good, I think, standing up again. I'm glad to have visited this room, but I don't think I'll ever want to see it again. I'd rather fix motorcycles than this one's waiting. And that's a wonderful characterization of the difference, of how different the narrator has become compared to the driven, mentally unstable Phaedrus. From someone who wanted to pry the lid open on the structure of reality to a guy whose philosophical involvement in the world is within the gears of a motorcycle. But before leaving, he just happens to go over to just one more door, and it's an office, and he notices a print on the wall. The print, Feinenger's Church of the Minorities, had an appeal to him that was irrelevant to the art, in that its subject, a kind of Gothic cathedral created from semi-abstract lines and planes and colors and shades, seemed to reflect his mind's vision of the Church of Reason, and that's why I put it here. All this comes back. This was his office, a find. This is the room I am looking for. Now look at this print and how orderly it is. And even if we didn't know yet what the Church of Reason was, this print discloses its nature. So it makes sense that he would put that print in his office. I step inside, and an avalanche of memory loosened by the jolt of the print begins to come down. The light on the print comes from a miserable cramped window in the adjacent wall through which he looked out onto and across the valley onto the Madison Range and watched the storms come in. And while watching this valley for me now through this window here started the whole thing, the whole madness, right here, this exact spot. And that door leads to Sarah's office. Sarah, now it comes down. She came trotting by with her watering pot between those two doors, going from the corridor to her office, and she said, "I hope you're teaching quality to your students." That was the seed crystal. As I stated earlier, the potential of what he could teach his students emerging from this dissatisfaction of how he's supposed to teach his students creates a perfect environment to plant and grow something, and that is the seed crystal. Seed crystal, a powerful fragment of memory, comes back now. The laboratory, organic chemistry, he was working with an extremely supersaturated solution when something similar had happened before his eyes as he walked. He saw a star of crystalline material in the solution appear and then grow suddenly and radiantly until it filled the entire vessel. He saw it grow. Where before there was only clear liquid, there was now a mass so solid he could turn the vessel upside down and nothing would come out. The one sentence, "I hope you are teaching quality to your students," was said to him, and within a matter of a few months, growing so fast you could see it grow, came an enormous, intricate, highly structured mass of thought, formed as if by magic. That seed crystal was, of course, quality. "Are you really teaching quality this quarter?" And he nodded and looked back from his chair for a second and said, "Definitely," and she trotted on. He was working on lecture notes at the time and was in a state of complete depression about them. What was depressing was that the text was one of the most rational texts available on the subject of rhetoric, and it still didn't seem right. Not that the wrongness was not this application of reason to rhetoric. The wrongness was in the old ghost of his dreams, rationality itself. He recognized it as the same wrongness that had been troubling him for years and for which he had no solutions. So writing via the church, writing rhetoric via the Church of Reason is all rules and grammar and syntax and order. You certainly are starting to see a theme here. This has been ongoing, that rationality, there's something really amiss about rationality, but how could that be? Isn't rationality what separates us from the apes? If you were to ask any Enlightenment thinker, what is our greatest attribute? Certainly they would answer the ability to reason, rationality, the ability to slice and dice and categorize and restructure the world in our own image. So how can Phaedrus have such a beef with, or an emerging beef at least, with rationality? The word ghost in this context will remind you of chapter 3, of course. Think of Newton's ghost. It was all table manners, not derived from any sense of kindness or decency or humanity, but originally from an egoistic desire to look like gentlemen and ladies. Gentlemen and ladies had good table manners and spoke and wrote grammatically. Soon the thought interrupted again. Quality? There was something irritated, even angering about that question. He thought about it and then thought some more, and then looked out the window and thought about it some more. Quality? So he's sitting in his chair, and for hours in his office, that afternoon, evening, and into the night, he's unable to move. He realizes that he has no clue what quality is. So he says he gives up and he goes home. at 3 in the morning. But does he forget it? No, he wakes up the next morning with a strange new bedfellow, quality. So what is he going to do about it? A lecture on something of which he has no knowledge? Lecture on something that he can't figure out what it is? This nagging new entity usurped all his mental energy for the preparation of his lecture anyway. So what to do? He picks up one of those little nubs of chalk and writes on the blackboard. Write a 350-word essay answering the question, what is quality in thought and statement? Then he sat by the radiator while they wrote and thought about quality itself. So no one can finish the assignment. Not surprising. So he tells them to just take it home and work on it and bring it next class. And the bafflement and the anger on the faces of his students for giving them this impossible assignment tells him he's not alone in his frustration. Quality, you know what it is, yet you don't know what it is, but that's self-contradictory. But some things are better than others, that is, they have more quality. But when you try to say what the quality is, apart from the things that have it, it all goes poof. There's nothing to talk about. But if you can't say what quality is, how do you know what it is? Or how do you know that it even exists? If no one knows what it is, then for all practical purposes, it doesn't exist at all. But for all practical purposes, it really does exist. What else are grades based on? Why else would people pay fortunes for some things and throw others in the trash pile? Obviously, some things are better than others. But what's the betterness? So round and round you go, spinning mental wheels and nowhere finding any place to get traction. What the hell is quality? What is it? What is quality? If you feel like it, and you haven't gone too far into the book, or you haven't read the book, why not put a comment? Tell me what you think it is. That'll be interesting. And thus ends part 2 of the book. So we have part 3 and part 4 coming up, and we have quite a journey in store for us. A high quality journey through the high country of the mind. So buckle up. So I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next Sunday for chapter 16.